All right, here we go. This is our last look at root position 5/7 chords here. We're going to do just two quick things. We're going to look at not the really typical scenarios like we saw in the last video where we're moving to 1, but some of the other, related motions that might involve a dominant 5/7 or a root position 5/7 chord, which is its involvement in deceptive motion and its connection to, or the voice leading that we might see with a cadential 6/4. So that's all we're going to do. Let's jump right in. The big thing to remember is that the voice leading stays the same. Leading tone resolves up, 7th resolves downwards. That's how a 5/7 chord resolves. These are just different contexts for us to apply those voice leading ideas. So here we go. Let's dive right in. So let's talk first about what happens in deceptive motion that involves the 5/7 chord. All right. Now, just like with all other possible progression scenarios where we could use a 5 chord, it's also extremely common to use a 5/7 chord because, again, it deepens the motion. It doesn't change the motion. It doesn't adjust the progression, the function in any way. Instead, it deepens what we're hearing. So this is going to be very much the case with deceptive motion. We're going to be here in the key of G minor, one of my favorite keys, actually. For a very simple reason, too. I just love that it has both flats and sharps in it. That's great, right? Okay, so here we go. G minor sounds like this. Now, deceptive motion, we know, is going from 5 to 6. That's deceptive motion because 5 wants to go to 1, but instead it goes to 6. And so if we're in G minor, we're moving around and we get to this 5/7 chord. Here it is to 6. You see what I mean about how it deepens the sound? If we're in G minor and I just did a root position 5 chord, going to 6, here's a triad. That's great. But the 7th chord, see how it's deeper and more, it sounds more like itself. It sounds more like deceptive motion by adding the 7th, which I just love. The beauty is that there is no adjustment of the voice leading to make this happen, right? If we look at this, we're in G minor, like I said, so on this 5/7 chord, the leading tone should be pretty clear. F sharp is the leading tone of G minor. It's still resolving upwards. And what note is the 7th of this 5/7 chord? The basses have the root, the sopranos have the 3rd, the tenors have the 5th, and the altos have the 7th. And where does the 7th want to go in any 5/7 chord? It wants to go downwards. And what do you know? It still does. And we still end up with the same voice leading that we have talked about since Theory 1 on the 6th chord in deceptive motion, which is that we end up with a doubled root, let me say that again. Doubled 3rd, which is the tonic of the key. Do in solfege is doubled, right? So if we're in G minor, if we look here, the leading tone resolves T, Do, and the tenors here are going from A, Re, G, Re, Do. And so we're still getting G, the tonic of the key, doubled in our deceptive motion. Right? So this is a 6 chord with 1 root, with 2/3 tenors and sopranos, and 1/5. In the alto voice. Right? But the big key here is, just like we sort of said at the end of the last video, this is not something that we're going to have to think a lot about if we go into any motion that involves a 5/7 chord with the mentality that we're going to resolve the tendency tones. We're going to resolve the leading tone upwards by step, and we're going to resolve the 7th downwards by step. if you go into any motion with a 5/7 chord, with that technique on the forefront of your mind, it's going to result in smooth writing. And this is very much true here, where we can let that deceptive motion really fully sound like itself. It's perfect. It's beautiful. Okay, so that's deceptive use of the 5/7. Let's look at the other example here, which is what happens if we want to use a 5/7 chord with the cadential 6/4. So just as a really, really similar thing as we just saw, there's not going to be much change to the overall voice leading. All that's going to change is having to do with a doubled note, which is kind of beautiful. So just to remind everyone, if we look at this left example here, we're in F major. We're on 5/6/4, the cadential 6/4, moving to 5/3, down to 1. Now, again, you might be saying to yourself, wait a second, I'm looking there, and I'm seeing the notes F, A, C in F major. That looks like a 1 chord. What's going on? Why aren't we calling that a 1 chord? And I'll remind you that it's because it's not acting like a 1 chord. It's acting like a chord that's built on 5, C, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's why we call it 5. And it's becoming a root position 5 chord. It's got some funky notes in it here that aren't part of that 5 chord, but it's becoming a root position 5 chord that wants to go to 1. And the big thing to remember is that we can't end there. We can't end there. It needs to resolve and become a full 5 chord before going to 1, right? So that's just a really quick snapshot of the cadential 6/4. So what happens, though, if we want to add the 7th, is that if we look at the tenor part here in the triad version, the tenors just stay on C, the doubled bass note, before moving down to A, Sol, Sol, Mi. But the tenors, previously singing that boring part, are actually going to get some of the juice here. Because what happens is we just take the octave, the doubled, right? C to C is an octave, and they're going to go Sol, Fa, Mi. And that Fa, the B flat, is the 7th of the 5/7 chord. And so the octave 8 resolves down, or moves down, I should say, to 7. And then look, we've got a beautiful C7 chord here. Root, 3rd, 5th, 7th. And that, again, just lines back up with that fully spelled motion. And so the shorthand that we use is we would just write, instead of writing the 5/3 part, because again, it's a root position triad, or it's a root position chord, we know that there's a 3rd and a 5th. We just write 5/6/4, moving to 7, and then that goes to 1. So the moral of the story here is that we can use the dominant 7th chord, 5/7, in any scenario where we would use a root position 5 chord. And in many, or in all cases, instead of changing the sound, changing the function, changing anything, it just deepens it. There may be some little voice leading quirks we have to sort of keep in mind. But again, as long as we resolve the leading tone upwards and the 7th downwards, it's all going to work out. And again, we can just look right here. Look, we've got a complete 5/7 chord, root, 3rd, 5th, 7th, going to an incomplete 1 chord. And it doesn't really bother us at all. We can clearly tell what the context is and what the meaning of that chord is. So that's root position 5/7 chords. They're really wonderful, and let's get practicing on them.